Okay. Thank you, Sandhya. Welcome to everybody. My name is Arjun Jayadev. I teach at Azim Premji University. I'm the director of the School of Arts and Sciences there. And my colleague Rosa and I are really delighted to welcome you all today to what really I am personally very excited by, which is to hear Professor Pranab Bardhan speak from his latest book, which is a kind of history, his own history, a kind of autobiography, but told in his typical warm and kind style. I should say that when I first got started in economics, which was I hesitate to say about 30 years ago, Professor Vinod Vyaslu, who's sitting there, was one of my teachers, and he gave me this very slim volume called The Political Economy of Development in India, and that was written by Professor Bardhan. And it was one of the most kind of, if you wanted word per page density of insight, it was one of the most extraordinary books, just 80 pages. But after all these years, while I remember some of the argument, I remember how it began. It started off with this phrase. He says, I'm told by many people that mothers in America tell their children to eat up their food at night because there are starving children in India. And then he says, I don't know how effective that is as a strategy for helping starving children in India. And then he goes on. And I still remember that. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that when I was asked by Ram Guha to actually, see if we could do this kind of event, I was delighted to do so because Professor Bardhan, apart from being, as Sandhya mentioned, an extraordinary intellectual, a person who spent, many years really trying to understand the Indian political economy, not just economics, and we'll make that distinction quite clear. He's also just a very wonderful writer and a very warm writer in kind of an old style, which I hope you all will buy the book and read the book. It's one of these extremely beautiful memoirs of times gone by. So today I hope that Professor Bardhan will read excerpts from the book. What we will do is we'll start off with Pranab reading a couple of excerpts, maybe giving a context for his book, and then Rosa and I have some questions. We both kind of devoured this book over the last few days, and then after that we'll open it up to questions and comments and so on. So please join me in welcoming Pranab Bardhan.
Thank you, Sandhya and Arjun, for those generous remarks. Sandhya already referred to the origin of the word charaiveti, which is the title of the book. Charaiveti is actually in Aitareya Upanishad. Thank you. Aitareya Upanishad, which was composed sometimes in between the 5th and the 6th century BCE. But what also interested me is that about 2 centuries later, Gautama Buddha, almost all his sermons and discourses, he used to end with charaiveti, charaiveti. What I'll do, just a few words about the nature of the book. It's not an autobiography at all. It's actually my interactions with others and also lots of stories to make it readable. But here and there are lots of observations about politics and society in India as well as abroad. And abroad has been most of the comments are in the Indian society and American society and Western Europe, but also some others. For example, I have a whole chapter on China. I visited China many times. The first time I was there, the day before the Tiananmen massacre, I was in Tiananmen Square interviewing the students who were in hunger strike that day. The day after, the night, the tanks rolled on. And since then, that was my first time to China, but since then I've been to China many times, so I've written a whole chapter on it. There is a whole chapter on, by the way, on English academia, which I've seen very closely because I've been visiting fellows at Oxford and Cambridge and also visiting professor at LSE. So I've seen the English academia from very close quarters. If you're interested, there are a lot of funny stories about England in the book. But in general, there are also some very serious issues, serious systemic issues. Capitalism, socialism, democracy, nationalism, these are issues come again and again in the book. I don't take too much time not to bore the general reader, but there are some thoughtful, on my part, thoughtful comments on systemic issues. Systemic issues always have interested me. And as some of you know, on those systemic issues, I was a member of a group which continues to meet even today. I became a member of that group in 1981, so more than 40 years is going on. It's a group to study. General idea was that Marx raised very important questions about capitalism, and some of his answers were wrong, but that does not preclude us from studying the same important questions, maybe with more modern data, modern methods of analysis, etc. The group's informal name is Group to Study Non-Bullshit Marxism. So in fact, quite a bit of the book, I discuss my interaction with people in that group. The other thing I should mention, again and again in economics, I have been attracted, apart from broad systemic issues, I've been attracted three kinds of issues. One is what economists call institutional issues. In fact, some of us were doing institutional economics many, many years before institutional economics became fashionable in economics. And in fact, even today, when institutional economics is very important in economics, they don't give much importance to the kind of work that we did in developing countries, because developing countries used to be, those days, marginalized. A second issue that has again and again preoccupied me, and particularly because of India, growing up even as a child, I often notice that there are big problems which are obvious problems. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the solutions are also obvious, but it doesn't get done. So the problem is how to get your act together. Several of us, each of us know what the solution is, but we don't do it, or we don't get our act together. This, in more technical terms, is called the problem of collective action. And that repeatedly have interested, even from my childhood and even today. So I have applied it to many areas. In a sense, the political economy book is also, when the elite is divided, elite doesn't get to do things which would have helped them. That's one of the motivation of writing. That was a lecture that I gave in Oxford and then wrote it up as a book. Is a problem of macroeconomic collective action problem. Then at the micro level, I have done some studies, including in Tamil Nadu actually, so one collective action problem I've empirically studied. I have some theoretical models also in collective action, but empirically I have done two areas in India. I've done collective action research. One is in Tamil Nadu. I studied 48 irrigation communities to answer the question, why is it that sometimes there are water conflicts, water disputes. Some villages, they seem to solve it reasonably well. Other villages, they don't. And I wanted to understand when does, on water issues, collective action works and when it doesn't. Similarly, I along with the whole team, did some on deforestation in the Himalayan foothills. Again, it's a collective action problem. Why does it not get done in some areas, some others do? That's, again, empirically, that's the problem that I have. And the third thing that has persistently come in my own interest and work is, of course, inequality. In fact, in the 1990s, I along with Sam Bowles, were directing a group, an international group of multidisciplinary scholars, international scholars, on studying the effects of inequality. The main motivation there, again, very crudely speaking, is usually those of us don't like inequality. We have some ethical issues. But even as an economist, one can show inequality is bad for efficiency. Not just is bad morals, but even bad for inefficiency. Including, by the way, going to the collective action problem. One of the things we found in the Tamil Nadu 48 village study, that villages that were unequal land-wise, controlling for everything else, they find collective action problem more difficult to solve. So inequality is important even in the how to get a solution of collective action problem. Okay, I think enough of serious talk. I'm going to now read some passages from the memoir. I was thinking of reading quite a few, but we may not have time, so I'll just cut down on the number. Let me start with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was very important in my childhood. She was a great cook, and she used to read my bedtime stories of stories that she has heard from her mother. She grew up in a village near Dhaka. I used to talk to her in the Dhaka dialect of Bengali. Even though that is not born in Kolkata, I was more used to the other dialect. But I was also her main letter writer. And this what I'm going to read is about my letter writing for her. She was not illiterate, but she liked my way of writing the letter for the simple reason she used to gush with a lot of emotions in writing to particularly her daughters about problems. And she liked my way of condensing these gushing emotions. And then I say, my skill at concisely expressing intense personal feelings honed in my grandmother's kitchen, because that's where she used to dictate the letters. She was eating. At the end, everybody else is fed. She used to be the last person to eat, and then at that time she will dictate letters to me. So skill honed in my grandmother's kitchen was later tested in a crowded Kolkata post office. There, an illiterate migrant worker from a Bihar village approached me to help filling the money order form that he required for remitting a meager amount of money to his family back in the village. When it came to filling the measly little space, I don't know whether those money order forms still exist. At the end, there's this little space where you can write letters, send messages along with the money. Then, when it came to that, this worn-out man sat on the floor on his haunches and told me what to write there in sporadic bursts of raw emotion, an incoherent mixture of his affection, anxiousness, and longing for his daughter and wife in the village, whom he has not seen for many months. My skill was sorely tested, and I think I failed, particularly because the language had to be Hindi, in which I was deficient. My next passage I'm going to read, somebody whom some of you may have heard of as a great intellectual stalwart in India, P.C. Prashanta Mahalanobis, the great statistician. So to save time, let me quickly go over the story. So the first time I met him was not in India. I was teaching at MIT at that time, and I was invited by a very important international trade economist, Harry Johnson. He was teaching at Chicago. He asked me to give a seminar in Chicago. At the end of my seminar, he said, there's a very important Bengali professor for whom Chicago University is giving a gala dinner. And I would like to take you there. Would you go? I said, sure. This is Mahalanobis. And then Harry Johnson arranged that I sit next to Mahalanobis. So when he was telling the whole table about his recent visit to China, he met Zhou Enlai, etc. So at one point, I whispered to him in Bengali, just to introduce myself. I said that I didn't imagine that I would have the great fortune to meet you all the way in Chicago. He didn't say anything. He went back on his stories about China. After some gap, he turned to me and whispered in Bengali. He said, you said it was a good fortune for you to meet me. Are you interested in a job at ISI? I was taken aback and slightly annoyed. I told him no, I had a good job at MIT. He said I should not misunderstand him. He was a man of clear-cut words, not given to beating around the bush. He had heard good things about me from Harry, and if I so wanted, I could have a job at ISI the next day. I said no to him once again. I think to assuage me, he then took me to the Chicago astrophysicist's home for supper, which was S. Chandrasekhar, who later got the Nobel Prize. Many economists don't know that Mahalanobis belonged to a literary circle in Kolkata, and he, along with somebody else, whom I'm going to mention in a minute, were the two whiz kids in that circle. One is Mahalanobis, the other is Sukumar Roy, who is the father of Satyajit Roy. And he's the pioneer in Bengali literature for nonsense rhymes and gibberish. And they used to kind of spar with each other all the time, and I give some stories. In all this sparring, Sukumar comes out as the mischievous character and Mahalanobis as the stern man. His sternness was evident also in the way he ran ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, in Kolkata. Those days, most people there had an office space, only as office space, only a cubicle with adjustable wooden partitions. I've heard that Mahalanobis used to express his satisfaction or dissatisfaction with your work by adjusting those partitions overnight. In the morning, if you arrived to find your cubicle had shrunk, you understood that the director was unhappy with your work. Of course, Mahalanobis, one great contribution is not merely his contribution to statistics, but he got to ISI a great number of major scholars, international scholars. So ISI became became a magnet for many international scholars, not just statistics, economics and many science subjects. One of the distinguished scientists who came to ISI and stayed on and became an Indian citizen was J.B.S. Haldane, possibly the 20th century's most accomplished biologist. I remember when I was a student in Kolkata, we often went to the ISI library because it had the best journal collection. In that library, we often saw this large Englishman in an Indian tunic with a fat, unlit cigar in his hand, reading Biometrica. I now wish I had the courage to go and talk to this formidable-looking man. Later, I read a lot about his eccentric personality. As a Marxist, he once claimed that reading Lenin cured his gastritis. He said political dissent led him to leave England for India. But another reason was that he would not have to wear socks. 60 years in socks is enough, he said. He often experimented on himself. In one of his self-experiments, he suffered perforated eardrums. He later said, and I quote, "The drum generally heals up, and if a hole remains in it, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment," he said. The next story I'm going to read is about my grappling. There's a whole chapter on grappling with life in Delhi and data. So this is about grappling with data. I should tell you, and this was a turning point in my academic life. I told you that I was teaching at MIT, and those days I was doing mostly mathematical, theoretical stuff. But I became uncomfortable generally because I was not dealing with real data. So at one point, I took a rather reckless decision to leave MIT and come back to India and really dirty my hands with data. In fact, at that time, now development economics has got more prestige, but at that time, development economics was not often considered as economics. It was called area studies. So I remember Amartya Sen, whom I knew well. I asked him, "Do you think I'm being too reckless in deciding to leave MIT, go back to India for doing this data?" He didn't discourage me, but he did say, "You should be aware what a big academic gamble you're taking." And I sometimes even had second thoughts. But anyway, so one is problem with data in Delhi that I'll tell you about. In the beginning, I was working with official data, mostly National Sample Survey data. Later, I collected my own data toward the end of the 1970s and up to middle 1980s. I was collecting data in villages in West Bengal, 110 random sample villages in West Bengal along with Ashok Rudra. And then later, I collected West Bengal, a different set of 90 villages in collaboration with Dilip Mukherjee. So let me tell you this story. Two stories of grappling with data. Once I went to the office of a particular ministry in Delhi in search of some data which I knew they had. But the officer in charge openly said that he could not show me the data, though he did not give me any good justification. I told him that these data were collected using taxpayers' money, and since no national security issue was involved, he was duty-bound to release the data. He just smiled dismissively. Back in office, T.N. Srinivasan, my colleague, told me that in India, when I wanted something in a ministry, I should not go to a lower official. I should instead work my way from the top down. This was called proper channel. TN gave me the contact of the higher level officer in the same ministry, who, when I told him what I needed, immediately called the lower official and asked him to share the data. The next day, I went to the same official who had refused me before. He was now full of oily politeness and said that it was the great fortune of the ministry that a professor like me was going to make good use of the data. But for the next few months, on one excuse or another, he made it very difficult for me to lay my hands on the data. After a lot of running around, I finally got the data, but I tried to fathom the reason behind his delaying tactics. Was it his resentment that I went to his boss instead of buttering him up? Was it his way of asserting his passive obstructive power, something on which the political scientist Jim Scott has written a whole book called Weapons of the Weak? Or did he expect some bribe from me? In India, even if you want to give a bribe, you don't know whom, when, how much. Occasionally, there are even more unpredictable barriers to research with data in India. A few years later, when I was at the Delhi School of Economics, for big data analysis, I used to send my research assistant to the IBM 360 mainframe computer located at a different part of the campus. By the way, this big machine, the data that it crunches, you can do it with your much more faster today with your smartphone. This computer is located at a different part of the campus, where after you submit your job on the long queue, you'd get back the results after 3 or 4 days. For small jobs, there was an antique IBM 1620 machine in the basement of the Delhi School of Economics building. One time, I had a relatively small job, and I needed the results quickly. So I asked my assistant to take it to the basement and get it done on the smaller machine. She soon came back and said that the computer was down. After a few hours, I sent her again, but it was still down. I decided to check myself what was going on and went downstairs. Usually, professors themselves did not go there. So when I was there, the officer in charge rushed to greet me. When I asked what was wrong with the computer, that it was down for so long, he said that nothing was wrong with the computer. They were not to run it when the air conditioner was not running, and he did not know why that was not running. I then went and found the man who was in charge of the air conditioner. He said there was nothing wrong with the air conditioner, but he would not run it as the water tank at the back of the air conditioner was empty. I presumed he was referring to the water-cooled condenser in a large commercial air conditioner that was connected to a water tank at the back. In hot climate, that could be important. Of course, he did not know why there was no water in the tank. By the time, I was desperate. So I went to the garden at the back of the building where the tank was supposed to be, and indeed found it empty. As soon as the gardener, who lived in a small cottage nearby, saw me, he ran to come and greet me. When I asked him why there was no water in the tank there, he sheepishly mumbled something in Hindi that I could not catch. By the time, a small crowd of peons and others had gathered around me. They told me that in connection with some religious festival, the gardener had village relatives visiting him, and given the water shortage in his cottage, they had come and used up the tank water to take their bath. I was dumbfounded, contemplating the chain of events. The gardener's rural family, through its simple action of bathing, had made a university department's computer system dysfunctional and disabled my analysis of data, which incidentally was about the problems of rural households in India. Is this what they call the butterfly effect in chaos theory? My next story is about something completely different. In this Marx group that I mentioned, a very important figure there was Jon Elster, a political philosopher and actually a polymath. Once Elster visited India, and after going back, he told me, you see, all the Indians were very polite with me, but would you tell me what Indians really think of us? I said, us meaning what? He said, us Westerners. I answered flippantly, and I said, oh, that's very easy. Indians think Westerners are superior technologically and militarily, but definitely inferior in terms of morals and personal hygiene. Elster thought for a while and said, morals I can imagine, but why personal hygiene? Then I told him a story that I heard from Sheila Dhar. Those of you who do not know Sheila Dhar was usually introduced as the wife of the economist P.N. Dhar, who used to be a member of the Kashmiri mafia around Indira Gandhi. But Sheila Dhar herself was an accomplished singer and writer of books capturing the bygone ambience of the world of North Indian classical musicians, which she used to inhabit. The story I told Jon Elster that I heard from Sheila, was about Siddheshwari Devi, who was a great classical vocal singer from Varanasi. When she was at the peak of her fame, she was once invited to perform at the Royal Albert Hall in London. This was her first trip to a Western country. The day prior to her performance, she arrived at the fancy hotel where she was put up. Going to the bathroom there, she was deeply shocked to realize that Westerners didn't wash their bottom. They wiped it with a piece of paper. The next day, when she sat down to perform on the stage, the thought of singing such heavenly compositions in front of an audience with hundreds of unwashed bottoms so agitated her that she wanted to cancel the performance. After a great deal of persuasion by the organizers, she barely managed to sing. I think I know I'm taking too much time. I will read 2 more stories and then I'll be done. One story is about my longtime friend. Some of you may know him or know about him. He's an Indian citizen, but of Belgian origin, Jean Drez. So I used to know Jean from middle 1980s when he was teaching at London School of Economics. And once I remember the first time I met him, I asked for his phone number. He started grinning because he used to actually teach at London School of Economics. In the evening, he will be with the homeless in the nearby park in the cold and damp of London. Another time, when I was visiting London School of Economics, he said, you come and eat dinner with me. We, the homeless, have taken over a big abandoned hospital, children's hospital actually. And you come, I'm cooking chicken curry tonight. So I accepted the invitation, but I had a lot of problems in finding the place. It's one of the rundown places in London, not very far, by the way, from the Oval cricket ground. So when I arrived there, let me find the right page. When I arrived there, Jean has just finished cooking chicken curry. And so he asked me to take a seat and along with the others. Asked me to take a plate and a seat. There are about 30 other people in tattered, grubby clothes and wraps and blankets seated already. So I seated myself next to one of them at the end of a long table. Jean, at the center of the table, was serving everyone from a pan. In the flickering candle light, because electricity was not there in that abandoned hospital, in the flickering candle light and dark shadows from a distance, the whole scene looked like Da Vinci's The Last Supper, with the Christ-like figure in the middle. Being a film buff, by the way, the whole book has a lot of references to films, my memory also flickered for a moment to a sinister caricature of the Last Supper in Luis Buñuel's 1961 Spanish film Viridiana, where the people at the table were homeless beggars, with the Christ-like figure in the middle being that of a blind beggar. While eating, I started talking to the man next to me, who was obviously enjoying his chicken curry with gravy dripping from his copious facial hair. I asked him how he came to know Jean. He said he did not know him. That morning, he had been released after 24 years in jail. I immediately thought to myself, in Britain, that length of a jail term is for really horrendous crimes, but I didn't dare ask him what was the crime. After all these years, he had no friends or relatives. He did not know where to go. Someone pointed him to this place where he might get some food and a place to lie down. Jean then went on, along with others, to build a commune with all these beggars and others there. It went on for some time, then collapsed. Jean's commune of homeless people also reminds me of the system of mutual aid that I once saw in a village of beggars a few miles away from Santiniketan in West Bengal. Ashok Rudra and I were then carrying out systematic village surveys, but this is not part of that. It's just a side thing that we did. Ashok Rudra and I once decided to go and visit this small village, rather a hamlet, and observe firsthand how these destitute people managed to live. We arrived at the boundary of the hamlet in a hired cycle rickshaw and then started walking somewhat aimlessly. Soon, we were followed by an intensely curious, bright-eyed Muslim teenage girl with a baby in her arms. We started talking to her, and she was highly amused by the unfathomable craziness of city people who wanted to know about their living conditions. She immediately appointed herself as our guide in visiting the beggar households, including her own, where she served us tea in clay pots. She said twice a week they would go in a group to the nearby open marketplace called Hat in Bengali, where they begged from the shoppers. Some of the households also had very tiny plots of cultivable land. What was remarkable was the network of mutual help among the beggar women. In one dilapidated hut we visited, there was an elderly woman who could not go to the marketplace to beg the previous day, as she had come down with a fever. We saw other village women bringing their cooked food to feed this ailing woman. A young girl in the neighborhood started oiling and combing her hair, the hair of this elderly woman, to make her presentable to the city visitors. I still remember this touching scene and the general spirit of incredibly upbeat camaraderie, conversation, and banter among these poorest of women. The last story I'm going to read is another place, Paris, a city where I've walked across many, many times. The French call it the activity of a flaneur. Once I was invited during my walk, after my walk, I was invited by my friend, the economist François Bourguignon, to dinner at an old cafe restaurant and motioned me to sit in a particular corner of that cafe restaurant. Once seated, he told me that the place where I was sitting was precisely where Balzac, one of France's greatest writers, used to come and sit many afternoons in the first half of the 19th century. And then I talk a little bit about Balzac and his food habits. Over dinner, when I told François that in public life in the city where I am from, Kolkata, a poet or a writer was more valued than an economist, he said the same was true in Paris. I then told him about an incident in my life. Once in Kolkata, a well-known Bengali writer, poet, friend of mine, his name is Sunil Ganguly, he recently passed away. Sunil Ganguly and I were walking in a Kolkata street where every few minutes he would be surrounded by young women asking for his autograph. These were days before selfie. While obliging them, he saw me waiting at a distance, rather bored, and then took pity on me, told these women that I too apparently was a well-known person. At this, two women came toward me and asked me what I did. As soon as I said I was an economist, they turned around and rejoined the crowd around Sunil. This put me and my discipline in our place. Thank you.
Okay, we'll spend we had a lot of questions, but I know people will also have questions of their own. So we'll spend maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to any other questions you have. So maybe, Rosa, you can start.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the book, and I think one of the things about the book that I really liked was it really puts characters behind people that we normally know as so and so et al. And then there's a personality, and there's little quirks to this. So it was really lovely to read about your episodes, especially as a young student, and working with faculty who are really legendary now in terms of Han, Arrow, and Strafa, and so on. Perhaps could you give us a sense of what intellectual life was like in a period during which economics was a little less professionalized in a sense and a little less compartmentalized?
I think this happens in all disciplines. In the beginning, it's much more general, and then over time it gets more specialized. In fact, this reminds me of a question. Do you know Perry Anderson, who's the British Marxist? He once told me, by the way, he read this also, and he once told me that, can you tell me why earlier we used to have this great economists writing great books? He said Adam Smith, Marx, all the way to Schumpeter. But today, even though we have brilliant economists, they don't write these great books. And that is related to this question. One of the answers I gave him is that today it's so specialized that it's very difficult to get a good economist who's good at the whole subject. Almost impossible now. In fact, it's become so minutely compartmentalized, as you mentioned. So in a sense, to have great vision. But I told Perry that probably is not the only reason. I think this has something to do with something, what I called the Americanization of economics. Since I went to, as a student to Cambridge, England, and then before that in India, Cambridge now is different, but at that time, when I moved from Cambridge, England to Cambridge, Massachusetts, I immediately saw the difference. So my teachers, I was planning to read something about her, Joan Robinson. Yeah. It was very interesting to see her functioning in a seminar. She would very energetically sit in the front bench, actually, and immediately fall asleep. And then when the speaker at the end, there's a clapping, she will wake up and ask very pertinent questions. Now, why is that? Because she has an intuitive understanding of the subject. She didn't know much mathematics. So she could skip all this mathematics that the speaker was talking about. But she would immediately go to the particular, the core of the subject. And I saw many such good economists in that milieu who are like that. They're not good at specialization, but they're good at understanding the core. Now, Americanization, what it has done to economics, along with making the subject more conservative, is done that. And this also is related to something else that I mentioned in the book. It's much more, in America, in Berkeley, somewhat different, but in most American universities, you hardly meet other non-economists. Even in economics, we meet only the people in your field. You hardly meet. So the specialization has gone to a particular degree in America, more than, and now of course, with the Americanization, this is happening everywhere. So somewhat a rather rambling way of answering your question.
Okay, thanks. So many of some of my colleagues are here, and we have the job market now in economics, right, where you struggle for months. This book is full of wonderful, what my students would call flexes, right? I mean, you heard one about Mahalanobis. But this is how one of the chapters starts. Okay, I promise you this is the sentence. When Robert Solow asked me in Cambridge if I'd like to join the faculty at MIT in the other Cambridge, I was taken aback and asked for some time to think about it. Okay? So not things that happen to normal people. But in any case, many of my students are here. Robert Solow is, of course, the extraordinarily great growth theorist who died a few weeks ago.
At age 99.
That's right, at age 99. But what I really, the stories that Rosa was talking about in Cambridge, but the other Cambridge, your MIT job, you came at the same time as Debreu, Stiglitz, Michael Pure, and Fashisti, Duncan Foley at the same time. All of you were there at the same time. Can you tell us a little bit, because of course these are now legendary people. You have great stories about Stiglitz and Robert Merton and Summers. Maybe you can tell us a few things about that time.
The stories or the...
Either, anything, your life there, the stories, whichever. I think they'd already...
Stories you better read, because
Yeah.
I have stories about all these people you
Yes.
mentioned. But I think this goes back to what I said in response to Rosa's question. When I moved from Cambridge, England to Cambridge, Massachusetts, by the way, I took 2 months to decide on solos because at that time the idea of going to the United States never occurred to me. I was thinking of finishing my degree and coming back to India. And growing up in leftist Kolkata, I had a visceral dislike for American politics. And also those are the days of the Vietnam War. Yeah. But solo interested me a great deal, I must say. I should tell you a story, so it's not in the book, a story of solo about the Vietnam War. So one time, in the lunch table, there was a practice of all faculty around the same lunch table every day, presided over by Samuelson. So one day, we had to sign a petition, which will be, the next week will be published in the New York Times, protesting the Vietnam War. So we were all signing. And again, a professor who will remain unnamed refused to sign, a very well-known name. He said, and the excuse he gave, he said, no, I want to keep my mind open. He would not sign the protest letter on Vietnam. Immediately came a cutting remark from Robert Solow. He said, if you keep your mind that open, stuff's going to ooze out. This is typical Solow's comments. Anyway, I think I suddenly, when I joined MIT, I was in the midst of essentially, it's a dynamo of a place. You can even, I say this, you can hear the hum of, and from one seminar to the next, you see the frontier of the subject moving. And they are all well informed who's doing what where, who's expanding the frontier in which way, and also there's a commercial aspect of it. One of the good and bad things about American academia is it's a culture of competition, at least among some universities. So they will all know who's being paid how much where, okay? And so you immediately, suppose you are doing good work, so immediately know about the salary a comparable person is getting somewhere else, then you feel good or bad accordingly. I actually have a story. Let me mention that story. We'll capture this a little bit. This was after, not MIT, I came back to India, and then after many years in India, I went to Berkeley the 1 year after the emergency in Delhi. So I went there, and I just settled down. I accepted the Berkeley professorship, bought a house, and settled down. Then a phone call came from the dean of a very famous East Coast university. And the dean essentially asked me whether I would like to join their faculty. And I immediately said, I just settled down in Berkeley, I bought a home, we like Berkeley, so sorry, the answer is no. So he then gave up, but he couldn't resist from giving me some. He said, can I give you some personal advice? I said, go ahead. He said, the way you said no, this is not how things are done in America. I said, how are things done? He said, you are not used to this country's academic culture. He gave me advice. He was patronizing me. So he said, when you get an offer, somebody offers you a job, you don't say no. You find out how much salary you're going to be paid. And I can tell you, Berkeley being a public university, we are going to pay you much more. But you didn't even ask for it. Usually what you do, you find out the salary, go to the head of your department and say, this is what somebody's offering me, can you match it, and all that. Now, all this sounds kind of crass commercialism, but there's also a good part of it. Let me mention. The good part of it is the culture of competition prevents something that afflicts many countries, including India, the academia in India. And I have heard stories about academia in some European countries. Italy, the Gambetta, who is the Italian sociologist, he wrote an article on the culture of mediocrity in Italian universities. What the competition, culture of competition does, apart from all its crass commercialism, what it does is keeps you on your toes, so you cannot just, wax in a, or in a stagnant pool of mediocre people. So if you don't work, if you're not productive, what will happen is that the better people will leave. And not merely that, you will not get good students, because good students will go somewhere else. And that keeps it going, which now some European countries, Britain has already done it, this competition is coming. So I saw that, in fact, one important part of my book, I wish Indian readers give some thought to it. I've given some lectures on it, but somehow people did not catch on to it very much. You see, I served in a top-level committee in Berkeley. That committee takes most of the important decisions about academic decisions, appointments, promotions, talking of job market. And it's technically is the advisory committee to the Chancellor, but Chancellor, I served in it for 3 years. The Chancellor accepted all our advice. The reason that it's a very hard-working job. I used to work 17, 18 hours a day. A lot of work, because there are thousands of faculty for which we had to take decisions, files and the whole process. But the reason I took the job is because I'm thinking all the time, as I do all the time, about India. So India, until more recently, most of the universities are public universities. Now, most of the major famous universities in America you hear about are private universities. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, these are private universities. But Berkeley is a public university. And yet, it is in the top 5 or 6 in the world. So I wanted to know, what is it institutionally, going back to my institutional interest, that keeps a public university at the frontier? And I wanted to understand that. And one is, which India is very bad at, not just under the current government, but under previous governments also. Universities do not have the institutional insulation from the political process. So politicians think, we give you the money, so we have a right to interfere. If in Berkeley, even there's a whiff of some political intervention, the whole faculty will rise in protest. Some of them will leave the university. Even there's a whiff or suggestion of political interference. And then I looked at what are the institutional mechanisms of this insulation, which is extremely important. In India, it's completely washed away. Now, of course, you hear about horror stories of political interference in academia. But that's not it. You can imagine if a place is completely insulated, then it can degenerate into this culture of mediocrity. So I'm a mediocre person, so I hire another mediocre person, and since you are insulated, nobody can do anything about it. Okay? That's where the culture of competition comes. Because if I do that, students will leave, other good faculty will leave and go somewhere else. And in fact, other places will bid them away, which, as I said, is crass commercial, but also serves. So it's insulation, autonomy, plus culture of competition, the two together.
Okay, so maybe moving from America, one of the, as you said, I mean, a really risky move to move from MIT to ISI, and at the time you did it. But you have some lovely stories which, I mean, resonate even now, about, look, does India have good quality data? How do we understand the world? And of course, for many of us who, like political economy, Bardhan and Rudra 1978 is, of course, one of these lodestones. Could you speak a little bit about that period and, especially your collaboration with, you know, in that piece, yeah?
Right. No, I think I was very fortunate to be in the Indian Statistical Institute because a long tradition. I already talked about Mahalanobis. Mahalanobis did some things which very few developing countries did. In fact, the reason he talked about Chu En Lai visited India, of course, Nehru, with Nehru, but he went and spent a great deal of time in ISI. And he told Mahalanobis, why is the Indian statistics at that time, it's no longer true, by the way, it's being decimated. Indian statistics is so advanced. By statistics, he meant actual, not statistical theory, but actual data. Mahalanobis, of course, is the field sample survey. In fact, I've been told there was a time, not very long ago, if you take the top 10 statisticians in the world, 3 would be Indians, okay, at least Indian origin. And particularly in things like field surveys, sample selection, etc., and this is a Mahalanobis contribution. He attracted such people. And for a long time, in fact, World Bank copied National Sample Survey. They call it Living Standard Survey. It's copying of what ISI did. So I'm very lucky that I arrived there. Great tradition of data. There's people who are obsessed with data collection, etc. And I was very lucky that I had colleagues like T.N. Srinivasan. T.N. Srinivasan, to this day, I would say, is probably in India's history, the most versatile economist. His PhD thesis is in mathematical theory, growth theory. Mine was mathematical growth theory. But he was immersed in the nitty-gritty of data. And he was a great help for me, mentor for me in that respect. So ISI played a very important role in my own. Unfortunately today, that tradition is gone in India. And people don't realize how bad a loss that is. In fact, and the current government is certainly not helping it. The current government has even suppressed 1 or 2 years of data, manipulating and all that. But it's not just the current government. Quite some time, National Sample Survey doesn't have resources. So now, National Sample Survey investigators are quite often casual workers, not regular workers. They are hired, given very short-term training, and sent out to the field. Earlier, since I used to work with National Sample Survey data, I also spent a lot of time with these NSS workers. And they will tell you things which are not available. If you look at the data tables, they will tell you stories, give me reasons why. He said, that data is not that good. But this area is really wonderful data, and so on. And they'll give me reasons. So I used to spend a lot of time in the NSS office with the field workers. So that gave me a certain opening, which I think is missing in the life of empirical workers all over the world and certainly in India. Because now you download the data and in fact, I will not again name economists. The economists essentially say, why do you have to go to the field? You just download you don't have to you don't have to show any interest in the people who generate the data. Data is just some numbers, not the people behind the numbers. This is the attitude, I think, of this technicality, the specialization that is done. So it's the algorithms rather than the people which become more important.
So one thing I found quite curious about when I was reading this is almost a calculated, maybe stubborn decision to stay away from policy making and collaborations with the state. And you talk about your stint as part of a commission of inquiry on plantations in Kerala as the, I quote, only work I ever did in my life for any government anywhere. And at some point you also mention a certain disappointment you felt when Sukumoy Chakravarti was collaborating with the Planning Commission at a time when the government was becoming increasingly authoritarian, and you felt a bit disappointed by those turn of events. And I also found it quite interesting in a panel or in a seminar, somebody asked you, I'm wondering which side are you on? And your response to them was, please find flaws in my arguments, not waste time on searching for my ID card. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, what was was it a conscious decision to stay away from policy making? And for economists who do want to collaborate with policy making and governments, how does one reconcile ideology with politics, and what are meaningful ways of collaboration for academics with the state?
That's a big question, Rosa, which I'm not sure I'll be able to answer in this short space. Now that's a personal attitude. I have maybe because I was all along, I'm a very intensely political person, all through. Even my mother tells me that I started reading newspapers at age 4. And to this day, even every day, I read at least 10 newspapers, now mostly on websites of different countries, by the way. I read about 6 Indian newspapers every day, but there are other countries' newspapers. So I'm an intensely political person. And being a political person, I knew that when economists have the illusion that they know how to fix things. In fact, I told Esther Duflo the other day, Esther has given a talk saying that economists are plumbers. You have a plumbing problem, you ask the economist will fix it for you. Economists are fixers. I told her, look, this is what Keynes also thought, that economists are dentists. Keynes didn't say that, economists are dentists. He said, economists should be as humble as dentists. Useful, but not great. Which, of course, I told Esther that Keynes, of course, didn't take that seriously because he himself did not do small things. He was saving capitalism, right? So he was not a dentist like economist. But anyway, what I was going to say, in this attitude of economists as fixing things so we are useful, sometimes sure we are useful, but we are also not aware that we are actually playthings of politicians. Politician knows they want to do something which economists will be useful. So they will call those economists. And since I'm in anecdotal mood, let me tell you a story that I've heard from, I think it's an authentic story about Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi, when she came to power, when she's 67 or something? 66. I think soon after the devaluation came. So Jagdish Bhagwati told me that Indira Gandhi called him, asked, so Jagdish went all prepared. He was in favor of devaluation, by the way, and at that time, shortly after, I wrote an article against devaluation. So Jagdish and I had a little debate there. But Jagdish told me that Indira Gandhi called him, and he got all prepared, preparing all the arguments for devaluation. Indira didn't ask him that question. You know the question she asked? She said, if I devalue, which are the economists who will support me and which are the economists who will write columns against me? That's a completely different thing, right? So essentially, I think there is sufficient diversity of economists that politicians can choose, pick and choose for their own purpose. That is one thing. Secondly, even when politicians are not as devious, what happens is that the way things get decided is complete. This in the United States Senate, it's called log rolling. Politicians will support a policy essentially thinking, what's in it for me? And they will sometimes go along even though they don't really support it, provided you something in exchange, you something. That's log rolling is what is done. Now, I, as the economist, will say as if, because my advice it was taken, it was a completely different process. So what I'm going to tell you is that the process of decision making and the politicians' decision making, economists are quite often pawns rather than the great technical expert, etc. Now, I may be exaggerating. So all along, I did not have taken very, I personally think, I in fact actually wrote in that chapter in a self-deprecating mood, namely that, in fact, that chapter ends with a quotation from Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw wrote in his book, Man, Superman, he says, those who can do, those who cannot teach. I cannot, therefore I teach. But you require a certain kind of things which are not just for economists, for a policy to work. Some people are good at it because they are not just economists, they are also those other things. They can take part in this game that is in the politicians, takes place in the politicians' chamber. I'm not good at that at all. That's one reason. By the way, even the only time in my life I did that, when I was teaching in Delhi School of Economics, K.N. Raj twisted my arm essentially. And I took that. And then to get the work done, I worked hard on the what to do about the plantations. And Suresh Tendulkar was my fellow member in that commission of inquiry. Suresh and I worked quite hard on that. We wrote a report, and in fact, you wouldn't believe it, we submitted to the government of Kerala. At that time, it was the Achyuta Menon government, which was the CPI government. In fact, in that report, there was even a mathematical appendix. When to cut a tree. Because plantation, one of the big problems, you don't prune the tree, you cut the tree, then it becomes more unproductive. There is marginal addition is less and less. By the way, when to cut a tree is a famous problem in economics, yeah. Wicksell. Anyway, so I wrote a mathematical appendix of that report. But what's happened to that report? By the way, it must be eaten up by the by the termites in some dungeon in Thiruvananthapuram. And that's what, as you can imagine, that didn't particularly encourage my policy advisory life.
Okay, we'll open up questions. We've got about 15 minutes, so if there's any questions that people have, we can start with that. We've got plenty, but I'm sure you have something. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, if you can introduce yourself as well, please.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan. That was really interesting. Lots of questions, but my name is Garima. I'm at the economics group at the Azim Premji University. I guess the broad question is, do you have advice for young faculty who are sort of setting up a research agenda? When you look back now, how did the dots sort of connect? Did you already know what questions you wanted to work on, or did questions sort of keep finding you as you went along? And how would you think people should attempt this now?
I suppose both. Since I was not particularly poor, but I didn't come from a well-off family. But I saw a lot of poverty around me, lot of poverty around me. So I didn't go to school because my father homeschooled me, but most of my playmates did not go to school because they could not afford to go to school. In Santiniketan, I didn't go to school because my father was coming occasionally and giving me homework. But all the other children I was playing with were, their mothers were maid servants and their fathers were usually rickshaw pullers. So at that level. So I've seen poverty from very close quarters. And so from my childhood, some questions immediately came to my mind. And I would say one of the questions that I mentioned before, collective action. Yes, poverty sometimes is a difficult problem to solve, but there are some things we ourselves can do. We don't. We blame somebody, this government is not doing it. Why don't you get together and do it ourselves? So I have been, even as a little boy, I was interested in problem of collective action. I think I mentioned in the book, Elinor Ostrom, first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics. I knew her quite some time back. She told me, you are the only, you must be a weird economist. You are the only economist who shows interest in the problem of the commons. Because she worked on the commons. I said, because I grew up in this kind of neighborhood where the problems were there, solutions were there, but it will not get done. So commons collective action problem always interested me. So some problems came to me from the way I was growing up. But then some others come up because essentially, let me give you from the micro-field level, you see there are certain problems immediately come to. But at the macro level, once you think about certain issues, you then started thinking about why does this problem persist? What is the mechanism which, that's why I'm interested in institutions, because quite often, in order to understand why a problem persists, for that, you have to think about the mechanism. Of course, theoretical, there's a whole literature on mechanism design, which originates in this kind of a question. But I'm not thinking that abstract level, but even simply thinking about persistence of certain problems gives you, originally I didn't think about them, but later, at the macro level, when I started thinking about the institutional mechanism for persistence, I then thought about other problems. Just to give you that example that the answer is both. You come across certain problems and then you start thinking about it. And others is bigger issues everybody is interested in, but then you have to think about that why certain things persist, certain other things do not. And that makes you think about the institutional mechanism. So yes, both. The answer, the word.
Professor Bardhan, what I wanted to ask you was related to the breaking up of the discipline into sub-disciplines, but you have also crossed schools of thought within economics. It's not just that you operate across sub-disciplines. You have been in conversation with different schools of thought. What allows that? Is that just competence, or were the people different and willing to have that conversation? And would a young Pranab Bardhan today be able to do that?
Let me say the following. Given my intensely political mindset, obviously I was interested in political science. I mean, that came very easily to me. And it also helped that the college, the undergraduate college I went to in Kolkata, at that time, no longer, but at that time, economics and political science was the same subject, together, taught together. So I had to read, today economists will be surprised, I had to read chapters from Aristotle's Politics, which hardly any economist have even heard about, a book by Aristotle on politics. So I sort of migrated into political science that way. But then later when I started doing village surveys, then I realized, I already told you that when I started doing village surveys, very few economists did it. Very few. And more than that, economists wouldn't do something which you cannot publish in a journal. And those days, in the beginning, this is what Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee always tell me. He said, I said that, in the beginning, I had to struggle. I collect my data in Indian villages. I submit the article to a journal, an important journal. They will not even get it refereed. They will immediately send it back. Said, oh, this is, it uses Indian village data, send it to an Indian journal. Immediately they will say. And of course there are other problems. Submission fee, I wrote to them, your submission fee is 1/3 of my monthly salary. So I once wrote to the American Economic Association Executive Committee, could you give another different submission fee for developing countries? They considered that in the American Executive Committee Association Executive Committee meeting and rejected the idea and wrote me a long letter explaining why they would reject it. And you can immediately sense the flavor of a Chicago type argument. As they said that we have figured out that an article in an American Economic Association, say American Economic Review article, will raise your lifetime income so much that you can borrow money today to pay this, etc. This is typical Chicago argument. Anyway, what I was going on to say, so there were a lot of obstacles to that at that time. What Esther and Avijit always tell me, that you broke the ground for us, because I persevered, and then with my Indian data, I published in the top journals. And now it's become, everybody does that. Development economics is now made it. But at that time it was area studies, not real economics. But going back, so while I was doing village survey, I realized economists were not doing them. Who were doing some similar things were anthropologists. Not all the anthropologists, social anthropologists. Some social anthropologists were doing it. So gradually I became interested in the methods anthropologists follow. And I immediately saw there's a problem. So anthropologists intensively study a village, live there for half a year to a whole year, and really know that village. And then write about as if that's general. Even the best of anthropologists. So think of the India's top social anthropologist who belongs to this state, M.N. Srinivas, okay? So everybody now talks about Sanskritization. Sanskritization based on one village, Rampura. Srinivas's village was Rampura. He named it Rampura, okay? So anthropologists quite often make I'm not saying Sanskritization is not correct. It probably is correct in some ways. Anthropologists generalize. If they say, this is what I think, but that's true only of that village. They don't do that. Quite often, they tend to generalize. But then, what is the method? So, what I did, I think you may be referring to that. So, I started thinking in that line. I organized a conference. Believe it or not, it was held in Bangalore, here. At that time, Bangalore. Today, Bengaluru. And I called it Conversations Between Economists and Anthropologists. But I realized immediately, talking to some anthropologists, that if I just put them together and let them converse, nothing will happen. They will talk past each other. So talking past each other is so common. So how do you make the conversation going? So what I did, I then said, no, you meet, but I'll give you a very narrow subject. Without narrowness, they will not meet. In other words, if you keep the road open, they will just go on, will go this way, the other way. You have to jostle. So I chose a narrow subject for that conference in Bangalore. I said, look, the economist goes to a village and says, this village condition has improved on the basis of some sample data, etc. How does an anthropologist, when his anthropologist says the condition in this village is improved, is a completely different way. And so I said, start the conversation, method of measuring change. So that made it very narrow. They couldn't avoid. So then we worked out, so I have an edited book called Conversations Between Economists and Anthropologists on methodological issues of measuring change. And we found out that economists do something better than the anthropologists, but on some things, anthropologists do much better. There are certain things that we cannot. So, to give you an idea, so we do, when you go and collect data, we see the outcomes, but we don't see the process. Anthropologists have a better story of the process. So, just to give you one example, anthropologists do much better in understanding the process, understanding the relations. So anyway, that got me to social anthropology and so on. But to go to your last point that you're making, I think compared to the past, multidisciplinary work is much more now. Is going on at a much more varied way. When I was doing it, very few economists at least were doing it, but today I know many economists who are involved with disciplines, other disciplines.
Okay, I think, are we okay? Last question. Yes, sorry.
I'm a journalist. My name is Sugata. You've spoken about a lot of personalities, but can you tell us something about a personality, a person, an economist, who became finance minister and prime minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh? Because you said you're not getting into policy, you were not interested in all that.
I do talk about Manmohan a little bit, but I used to avoid him when he was the prime minister. I knew him a long time back. Avoid him because just the whole security stuff. I mentioned that once he invited me to dinner, and I was taking one of my books to give it to him. They would not let me because the book can be a terrorist, weapon, and so on. So his security will not allow me. So that kind of whole penumbra of things I don't like. But Manmohan surprised me certainly. A man I could not even imagine before he became the finance minister that this will be that he will be a politically successful person. But even him as the finance minister, that he could do certain things, economic reform of that kind, was because of a particular conjunction of events. If you think of that time, in certain months in 1991, that they could, even a minority government could get away doing things which I'm not sure other times you could do. But things were already in the air. If even 1980s, delicensing was already on. Delicensing was done in Indira Gandhi's last government and Rajiv Gandhi's government. So it was already going on. Trade reform was came much later, but the domestic reform came earlier. So it's not just Manmohan did that, which was very much in the air. Manmohan, of course, intellectually also contributed earlier because he was showing that India's export, he has a whole book on it, India's export performance, there's a lot to be improved, is not because there is no world demand. It's because cost side is impaired by the policies, etc., which are very important contributions, no doubt. But in terms of politics, there will be different stories. Was Manmohan an active politician, or was he used by the family? That's different. Why was he chosen as the prime minister, and so on. There are all kinds of stories. I don't think and then when the UPA government ended, there's these corruption stories, okay? Now again, how he's the most uncorrupt person in the world, and yet his regime became associated. I think exaggeratedly by the current regime did that. We all know now CAG reports were exaggerating the notional losses, etc. But these are forces of politics which is beyond the power of individuals, and certainly a person, absolutely sincerely nice person like Manmohan.
All right, so we should stop here. Thank you very much, Professor Bardhan. Thank you all for being here. You've been inspirational. Some of my colleagues will take many of these things to heart. So thank you very much.
On behalf of BIC, I'd like to thank Professor Bardhan. As previously mentioned, the books are available outside, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to sign. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Good night.